It's been written that of the making of books there really is no end, and I suppose the same thing could be said of the collecting of books by people who are bibliophiles, and I would really describe myself as a book collector or a bibliophile. And the book that has particularly interested me over the last few decades is the Passover Haggadah, the book that tells the story of Passover and is the book around which the Passover Seder is conducted. The earliest, and I've divided my collection into a number of different categories, the first one being the oldest ones that I own, and this is actually the oldest one. It was printed in Amsterdam in 1780, though the original version was a book that was published the exact same thing in 1695. But here you have the title page of almost any Haggadah. This one spells out Amsterdam, and then it gives the year in the Hebrew dates. And what really makes a Haggadah interesting in terms of its usage is that if you go to about the middle, the section of a Haggadah which is opened up when people drink wine and eat the matzah and the charoset, this one shows it was well used when a family used it perhaps in the early 1800s. And what makes this particular version, printed in 1780, notable is that in the back it has a fold-out map of the land of Israel. You can see the bottom. It's called the Yam Hagadol, the Big Sea, which was the Mediterranean, and then the division of the land among the 12 tribes of Israel. And that was part of the original Amsterdam Haggadah. Others that are in the collection here that come, this one from Basel in 1700s, late 1700s, and one from, two of them from Fürth, a city in Germany. It was called Fiorda in the Hebrew, and this one, and this one is also from Fürth. And these all contain the traditional text with some commentaries. And if you again go to the middle, you can almost see some wine stains here at the passage, and almost some crumbs of matzah. And there's one here from Bialystok, which was a major city in Eastern Europe. Again, the Haggadah, this one has, let's see, it has wine stains. You should be able to get to it. Right about here, you can almost see the wine stains on the page. Perhaps the greatest interest in old Haggadahs, which were very often artistically done, was the Sarajevo Haggadah. And this is a republication of the Sarajevo Haggadah. There was a novel written a few years ago called People of the Book, which tells about the discovery of this Haggadah and how it was kept by a particular family. This is a particularly well-done facsimile of the Sarajevo Haggadah. This one was done with a text on the English side, but this one was published with gratitude to the National Museum of Sarajevo. So now with modern publishing, many of the older Haggadahs from the Middle Ages have been reproduced. This one is the Haggadah of Amsterdam as well. And the earlier ones, of course, were done in hand with great calligraphy and great artwork. This one is the Moravian Haggadah. And then there is a the Copenhagen Haggadah, again published in Amsterdam, 1739. And you can see the very delicate artwork that was part of the original one. What's interesting art-wise is that artists always captured the ancient scenes in the genre of their time, so that let's say a palace of the pharaoh in Egypt really came out to be very much like a palace of Denmark in the 1700s. These are all reproductions of old Haggadahs, a whole series done by an orphan home in Israel. It's called Diskin Orphan Home, and they did these as fundraisers, not in color, but capturing the Haggadahs. There are literally thousands of versions. This one I always like to point out. It's probably the smallest Haggadah known. The complete text of the Haggadah, printed in Jerusalem in 1960, I believe, and 1960, you can see here. And it has, again, you could follow this. It's certainly a pocket-sized edition of the Haggadah, though I don't think one would want to sit at the Seder table and look at it that way. The second group of Haggadahs here, I call them Haggadahs with commentaries. The Haggadahs always evoked commentary by Jewish scholars, and there are literally thousands of them. The older Haggadahs do have commentaries on the side by medieval scholars, but these are of a more modern ilk. Probably the oldest of these would be a German Haggadah. It was with a commentary done in 1918 by M. Lehmann, a well-known scholar in Germany. The text itself is in Hebrew and German. There are illustrations, etchings or copies of etchings, but the primary thing, even though it contains the text at the top of each page, you can see the voluminous commentaries at the bottom of the page elucidating the text. This was then redone in English as the Layman's Passover Haggadah, published in 1975 in London, Marcus Lehmann. And again, you can see the text at the top of the page and then the translation of the commentaries at the bottom. So there are commentaries here ranging from Hasidic masters, probably the foremost Talmudic scholar in the world today, Adin Steinsaltz, and his commentaries have been captured in this edition, together with the traditional text, translated into English. Others, one that particularly is of interest, that of Shlomo Carlebach, who was the troubadour, singer, composer of many songs that are now part of the synagogue experience in America and literally all over the world. And he was a storyteller. And so punctuated in this Haggadah are his stories. I just turned to one, for instance, at the part of the Seder where we set aside the cup of Elijah, he tells the story. I want to share with you two Eliyahu Hanavi stories, one from a long time ago and one from today. And then he tells a cute story about Elijah the prophet. There are Hasidic masters, all kinds. More, this one in particular has is a very significant one. It's called the polychrome historical Haggadah. And what the compiler of this, Jacob Friedman, did is he took the entire text of the Passover Haggadah, and you'll see that it's printed in various colors: black, orange, green, gold, and so on. And what that is each of those colors represents the time from which that particular part of the prayer or the passage comes. The black being the biblical period, red being the Tannaitic period, orange the Amoraic period, the Gaonic period, Middle Ages, modern times, and contemporary. And what this really gives you is an appreciation of how the Jewish prayer book, including the Haggadah, is a stitching together of phrases that come from various eras of the Jewish experience. The black here would be quotations from the Bible. The rabbis would have added in this, basically, this is as it is said. It would have been nice if Rabbi Friedman, the compiler of this, ever finished his project that he was embarked on before his death of compiling a prayer book in the same way, a polychrome prayer book, which would show how the prayers are really an amalgam of various civilizations. Here you find, for example, the 10 plagues, and it'll give the biblical source for each of them, but it will introduce them with things that are taken from the Talmudic period, etc. I happen to have 2 copies of that one. This one is signed, done 1974 by Dr. Friedman. Perhaps the most, the 3 best, this one is an interesting one. It's by a woman who is very enamored with Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism. And she has a different take on parts of the Seder from a Kabbalistic or mystical perspective. Another one which is probably of the most interest today are some of the newer ones. I would particularly recommend for people this one containing the commentaries by Jonathan Sacks, who retired. Actually, he needs to be called Lord Rabbi Jonathan Sacks. He was the chief rabbi of the British Empire and of England, and is perhaps one of the top Jewish scholars and spokespersons in the world today. The text is the same as the traditional text. It's his interpretations. For example, he sees the 4 children as a vignette of the Jewish people, and gives an explanation of each one. This is another relatively new one. I'm not really familiar with the work of the author, but it's an excellent Pesach Haggadah done with some wonderful commentaries. In an ideal Seder, each person at the table would have a different edition with different commentaries, and there would be a back and forth kind of interplay of the commentaries. Oh, this commentator says this, or this story is told about this. That's an interesting way to do a Seder, as opposed to everybody doing exactly the same thing. But primarily, the commentary Haggadahs are wonderful as a preparation for Passover, to look it over and to maybe glean something that one can share at the Seder. The next category, what I call artistic versions. Some of them are just artistic in terms of a unique kind of way of printing them, this one to look like a piece of matzah, but artists have put their hand at illustrating the Haggadah. And the one that is most well known is that of Arthur Szyk, who was a wonderful artist, an American artist, and in his very decorous way, here he illustrates the four sons of the Passover story: the wise son, the wicked son, the one who is simple, and the one who doesn't know how to ask. And throughout the Haggadah, these are, you see how he's done the cup and done it with various bits of calligraphy as well. Another artist whose work is well known is that of Ben Shahn. Ben Shahn was also an American artist. His Haggadah is quite beautiful. I always like to point out, this is the way Ben Shahn signs almost all of his artwork. At the back, because one of the things at any Seder is the singing of songs, and a very popular song is Haggadah, which tells about a goat who is sold by his father, by a man, for 2 zuzim. And here he illustrates the father who bought it for 2 zuzim. Then came the cat that ate the goat for the kid. Then came the dog that bit the cat. Then came the stick that beat the dog. Then came the fire that burned the stick, the water that quenched the fire, the ox that drank the water, the butcher who slaughtered the ox, the angel of death who slew the butcher, and God, the Holy One, who emerges at the end as the kind of hero of the song. Beautiful illustrations, I think. This one I ought to point out too. This was done in Germany in the 1930s. It's called the Haggadah for Children, and it is in the traditional text and German, but it has in it a number of pages that you can that can occupy children during the Seder. They're not in perfect repair, but you have here the various scenes of the Seder that a child could move around. Very kind of primitive way of doing it, but that's the way children's books were done. Here you have, again, the children of Israel crossing the sea. The next category would be the actual traditional texts that people have used at Seders for a long time. The most well-used or well-known Haggadah are those that have been distributed over the years at supermarkets and so on, distributed as an advertising gimmick by Maxwell House Coffee. It started in 1930, and they published editions year after year. This is one of the earliest ones. This one, 1939. Again, the traditional text. Nothing original about it except maybe the English translation, capturing some of the artwork of earlier Haggadahs, but these were for mass distribution. You have this one. This one here was the Passover Seder service, again, by Maxwell House Coffee, good to the last drop. They give you this one was done in 1932. They give you the calendar for the next few years as to when to observe Passover. So these are all traditional texts, and generally with translations in them. Some of them do, some of them don't. The next, and these are up to here, these are what I would call departures from the tradition. In other words, ways in which the Haggadah was kind of modified. One of the first attempts to do that was in early Reform Judaism with what was called the Union Haggadah. And tellingly, it opens from left to right, not right to left. And it eliminated, as did the early Reform prayer book, a number of things that may have been thought to be extraneous or objectionable, and added some things as well. Added some music, including some English hymns, that were part of early Reform practice. That then made its way into later editions of the Reform Haggadah, this one with the artwork by Leonard Baskin. And it's done both in a large form and a small form. The Union Haggadah, this one, has just been republished with gender-neutral language called the New Union Haggadah by the Society for Classical Reform Judaism, for those who want a more classical Reform type of Seder service. This also is an early Reform prayer book, Reform Haggadah, done in 1913 by a rabbi in Philadelphia. And again, English hymns, we beseech thee to deliver us, O Lord, instead of doing them in Hebrew. That was, again, part of early Reform practice. So there are after the Reform Haggadah, an innovative Haggadah was called the New Haggadah, compiled by Mordecai Kaplan and his associates in the Reconstructionist movement. And this one was done in 1941 and then had later editions. And among the changes here were he eliminated, for example, the recitation of the 10 plagues as being something that should no longer be dwelt on to such a great extent in the Passover story. This also contains some music in it as well, but not English hymns. And then we come to Haggadahs in various languages. I have primarily a number of Haggadahs done in German with German translations. This one in particular is also German. This one was done in, I have to find it, in 1915, I believe. And it was called the Haggadah for the telling of the Exodus from Egypt for both nights of Passover. One in Spanish, another in Spanish, and a third one in Spanish. And then while I don't have, and you can see the Hebrew, and then, for instance, the washing of the hands, lavado de manos. I don't have the full Haggadah, but someone gave me this because they had attended a Seder in Tokyo, and this has the beginning of the Haggadah, the candle blessing, both in Hebrew, English, and in Japanese. These are again in German. Now we have, with modern publishing, Haggadahs meeting special needs. The kibbutz movement in Israel developed its own kind of observance of Passover, a Haggadah that dwelt not on the ancient story, but on things that are more modern, contemporary, complete departure from the tradition. This would have been used on a very progressive kind of a kibbutz. Others that are of interest, the Jewish humanists who they have chosen not to include the name of God in their services of any kind, and emphasize the role of people in working out their destiny, but again preserving the Passover Seder. And Jewish secularists, including those who paid a lot of attention to the Yiddish culture. Some rather nice artwork in it. These are Haggadahs that I've compiled since the 1990s for our own family Seder with desktop publishing. That's kind of possible, and did a new one this year, but I don't have that one here yet. This Haggadah for those involved in 12-step programs, the anonymous Haggadah, which again relates the story to their particular needs. A poet's Haggadah done completely with the poetry that they've collected from various places. And in the 1960s, it was popular for, I would call them Jewish hippies, to create their Haggadahs, emphasizing nature and ecology and so on, though those are still our concerns. And also those who were using the Passover Seder to promote their political perspective, the Freedom Seder, which included quotations by Martin Luther King, but also included quotations by some of the more maybe controversial, but also progressive world thinkers. Kind of, some people think of it as a Marxist Haggadah. It's not really that. And, for instance, a group in San Francisco devoted to the sanctuary movement published their Haggadah. This was done in the midst of the civil rights movement, a common road to freedom, and finally this one done in 1976 to highlight the bicentennial of America, called the Bicentennial Haggadah, which emphasizes the confluence of democracy and the Exodus story. And we come to the last section here, and these are Haggadahs that have been developed for children. This one is probably the earliest for the youngest child at a table to be able to occupy him or herself with this various parts of the Seder. The 10 plagues, which you can open each one of them. You have the wild animals, the frogs, the death of the firstborn, darkness, and the eating of the festival meal. These are all parts of the meal, and so on. And then different kinds of Haggadahs. This one, again, the 3D Haggadah. In order to appreciate the art in this Haggadah, you have to put on the 3D glasses, and it leaps off the page in 3 dimensions. Seder with the animals. So these are all specifically done for children. Uncle Eli's Haggadah, special for kids, with a lot of fun, including some games that the children can play, but also putting it into kind of Dr. Seuss type language and so on. We were slaves to King Pharaoh, that terrible king who made us do all kinds of difficult things, like building a pyramid of chocolate ice cream when the sun was so hot that the Nile turned to steam. And then for families, so that it can involve more children, these are a number of family Haggadahs. Students, college and graduate students, have put together Haggadahs, very often just in a very simple Xeroxed fashion. This is called a graduate student Haggadah. These are done by various student groups around the country. And then women who have found a new appreciation of the Passover story. This is one of the earliest ones, a women's Haggadah. The first published one was the San Diego Women's Haggadah, and this was done in 1980, and emphasizes, instead of the 4 sons, it talks about the 4 daughters who questioned, why is this night different? And explains it in terms of women's concerns. And then finally, the the most contemporary, in our rush to do everything instantaneously, a 60-minute Seder, a simple Seder, and the 60-minute Seder was not enough for some people, so somebody came out with a 30-minute Seder. And just in case that was too long, On the internet, someone recently came up with the 2-minute Haggadah, a Passover service for the impatient. And finally, I developed a Haggadah for use in our religious school in 1964, and that kind of made its way into a number of editions, and the final edition is the one that was published in 2003, which 1987, but then revised in 2003, which is used in households and communities around the country. So there's no end to the making of Haggadahs. I'm going to keep collecting them. I try to add at least 1 or 2 a year to my collection, new ones. And always anxious for people who are thinking about throwing away old Haggadahs. If they want to give them to me, I'd be happy to have them. Every once in a while I'll find one that I don't have.